Welcome everybody to our session on renewable energy and biodiversity. Thank you for being here today, and those online and those present here. This is an hour-and-a-half session. It's going to be very packed with fantastic speakers. And you say, I could have done a little bit less in terms of speakers, but there are just so many stories to tell. And unfortunately, we didn't have many opportunities to talk about renewable energy and biodiversity. As much as, we would have really liked to have more opportunities, because this is really an urgent issue that needs to be addressed. The race to zero by 2050, or even better by 2030, is going to push the renewable energy sector really, really fast to grow. And what we have been talking with a group of organizations, NGOs, and companies is really the importance of making sure that this development doesn't happen at the expense of biodiversity. So we have worked together with a group of organizations starting 2019. These included EDF, EDP, and Shell. We work with the biodiversity consultancies and 4 NGOs members of IUCN, BirdLife International, Fauna Flora International, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and the Nature Conservancy. 3 out of 4 available today to present. And we work together really to understand how to implement the mitigation hierarchy in the renewable energy, and specifically on solar, onshore, and offshore wind. Try to understand what is avoidance, what is minimization, how you do restoration, and what are the extreme cases where you need an offset. We have developed a number of tools, and first and foremost, our precious guidelines that really were the result of a lot of consultations and discussions with the group of companies and NGOs and beyond, because we really did 2 public consultations. And in addition to this, we have developed synthesis reports in 5 languages that are really targeting the C-suites, so for the CEOs and decision makers to understand the issue and understand what are the main practices that need to be implemented. And then importantly, we have worked on early screening. The key step, and I'm sure you're going to hear this from my colleagues who are going to speak later, so I will not speak about how important is early screening, but we developed 3 different set of questions, and each is associated to a specific technology, and each question is linked to a specific database that can offer data to answer the question. And these are really questions to help you raise a red flag. They're not, scoring, or they're not, early risk screening specific, kind of a tool, but assessment tool, but it's really to raise the red flag, which is such an important element, especially for those organizations that have to make quick decisions. So based on this, we have 8 speakers. And these are amazing, they have all collaborated with us and will collaborate hopefully in the future. Because of COVID, we decided to break in 2 groups, but there is there is nothing different between the group 1 and group 2. It's just to make sure that there are not too many people on stage. We are going to have Ricardo Tomé from the Biodiversity Consultancy, Julia Turon from Shell, and she's joining us by Zoom, Clément Lavigne from Total Energies, and Pippa Howard from Fauna Flora International. In the second group, we are going to have Nicola Crockford from the Royal Society of Protection of Birds, also representing BirdLife International. We are going to have Joe Kisheker from TNC. Joe, he was around, he's coming. He's that back there, coming front. And then Etienne Berry from EDF Renewables, and Fabien Quietier from Biotope. So thank you very much, and so let's get going. So first I'm going to ask Ricardo to give us an overview. What are the main impacts, and based on also on your field experiences, what you think are the main solutions, and in early risk screening. All this in 10 minutes.
Okay, can you hear me well? Is it okay? Is it working? Okay. It's a relief to speak without a mask. Yeah, that's a very simple question. No, it's rather complex because, first of all, and most importantly, impacts from renewable energies like wind energy or solar are very site and species specific. and that raises some challenges. Of course, there are more or less general solutions and approaches, but each case is a case, and we should know well what biodiversity values are at each site and how do they behave, because actually even behavior of species can differ according to site. And it's also project specific. So I'll try to summarize most important impacts, for instance, from solar are of course land use. Solar infrastructures usually take a lot of land to be installed, so it's a big habitat loss for the species that were living there. There may also be, of course, impacts in terms of fragmentation, habitat fragmentation and displacement of the species that were using the area previously. Can be a lot of underground water consumption, especially for concentrated solar in areas very often like the desertic areas where water is rather scarce. So this will be affecting important habitats that are very tied to these specific areas, and the whole plant and animal community living within those habitats. And then, not to forget, there are also impacts associated with the power line infrastructures associated with solar, especially collisions of birds with the transmission lines and the electrocution of birds in the distribution lines. For wind farms, we have also an impact on the ground, so the habitat they are using, it's usually rather smaller than on solar, but don't forget all the accesses, the roads that have to be also very often open to provide access and maintenance for the wind farm. So there is, of course, an obvious impact also on habitat. Again, causing this displacement of species, fragmentation, etc. But most importantly, there are also impacts in the air, especially concerning birds and bats that can collide with the moving blades of turbines, or even with the turbines' towers. This was on onshore wind. The offshore wind raises even more complex problems. The ocean, we have been talking about this in previous sessions, is a more complex and changing environment, and so there can also be, for instance, important impacts in terms of underwater noise caused by all the piling and drilling. So when installing turbines that are fixed to the seabed, there will be an increase in vessels traffic during the construction of the wind farms, but also during operation and maintenance, and this is a risk. There is a collision risk for instance, sea mammals like cetaceans or sea turtles. Then the other type of impacts like displacement, collision still remain, such as the impacts from associated power lines on shore. And you asked me also about solutions.
Is there a solution? There are solutions.
Yeah, we have also been talking about this in previous sessions. So most important is definitely to avoid those impacts previously. So to conduct spatial planning, sensitivity maps, early risk screening, so identify at a very early stage of planning a project to avoid most important biodiversity areas. This could be done at a very broad scale, national or regional scale, using available spatial plans or sensitivity maps. But also then, after selecting a less sensitive area that was left free, still conduct the early risk screening, so early design risk screening. This will inform at the project scale what will be the mitigation measures that will be necessary to implement, whether there is still some avoidance, like micro-siting turbines, that can still be done to avoid future impacts. This will inform the scope of the environmental and social impact assessment that has to follow up. This will inform also all the mitigation programs that will have to be set at place. So it's a very important stage to act as early as possible to avoid impacts. Then, of course, if still the wind farm when the wind farm is built in a place, there will be still the need definitely to minimize some of the impacts. And there are many, many different ways of minimizing impacts. Some impacts cannot be minimized. People yesterday mentioned that at the deep sea it's very, very difficult, if possible, to minimize impacts. There are other types of impacts like displacement barrier effects, for instance, from migratory birds, that are very difficult to assess how much this is impacting a population. So we can be, for instance, shutting down turbines to avoid collisions at wind farms. This is already done in several wind farms. So this will avoid collision. But what happens with the species of birds that are avoiding the wind farm or avoiding several wind farms and making a big detour on their migratory routes? This has not been studied yet. It may not be affecting too much some birds that are healthy in a very good body condition, but what about birds that are already very tired in a poor body condition? Maybe they will not survive simply. What is the proportion of these birds that is being affected by cumulative impacts from several wind farms across a migratory flyway, for instance? All this is necessary to address. That's why avoidance is crucial, and not just to go to the next mitigation hierarchy measures, such as minimizing. But still, as I said, we can shut down turbines to avoid collisions. This can be done using observers or even technologies such as radar and cameras nowadays. There are plenty of technologies now to try to minimize underwater noise as well, to make it either less strong, at least to avoid using noisy methodologies when constructing wind farms, when sea mammals are present. So there is the need to have observers or other detection methods at sea to detect in advance if sensitive species are present. There are lots of things that can be done already, of course, and they are done, fortunately, to decrease the risk of collisions with transmission lines, like signaling transmission lines using bird flight diverters. There are some acoustic deterrents that can kind of scare bats to get close to turbines. And yeah, there is plenty of things that is being developed using very much technology nowadays available. I would not even go, I think, at this stage to speak about offsets, because this is the last resort. So offset is compensation if there is still residual impacts after all the avoidance and minimization and restoring habitats have been already done. So we should not think on offset in advance and as the solution. So I'm not going there at this stage, I guess.
That's a good point, Ricardo. So in fact, actually in the guidelines, what we have really together recommended is like these projects to try to localize them in areas where throughout, by implementing all the measures, there are really not going to be residual impacts on biodiversity. So that will also cut out the problem, because for business, offset it's a costly stage to implement. So it's really for everybody's benefit not to get there. So Ricardo, you highlight all the potential, many of the potential impacts, a lot of the solutions. I like to ask Julia from Shell, who's one of the companies and certainly one of our colleagues that participated in the projects. What is their experience and why we use the word mitigation hierarchy as a framework for these guidelines? And this was done really on purpose and by design, let's say, to structure the recommendations around this mitigation hierarchy, which has been used as a framework by many, by other sectors, especially in the extractives. And the idea was, well, let's ask Julia to tell us why and what is the benefit of using the mitigation hierarchy as the framework for our recommendations. Is she with us? Yes. She is. I can see her there. We are coming to you, Julia. Hold on. And you're there. Fantastic. Can you see us? Hi, Julia. She's frozen. And actually, I need a speaker because otherwise I can't hear her. She's still frozen? Yeah. Okay. So, is it without the... Thank you. Is she frozen? So, okay. So let's ask Clément. Maybe you can start from the Total perspective also oil and gas, renewable energy, I don't want to start talking about climate change today, but talking about experiences and learning from one difficult sectors to another one. What have you learned in one sector, of the extractive that you can transfer to the renewable energy, and what are, the challenges?
Sure. Thank you very much. I think yes. When we're talking about transferring information or knowledge from one sector to the other one, there is a lot of room for options. I guess the first thing that Total Energy would be doing is ensuring that we have similar standards for the two sectors and for the two activities, meaning that we are going to make sure that we implement adequately first the best environmental practices, and also progressively go into more detail. So as we all know, one of the challenges associated with renewables turns a lot around biodiversity. We know that 80% probably of the issues are related to biodiversity, and that's both during the construction and operations phase. And so we're going to be very attentive to making sure that those two aspects are adequately addressed. Then we're going to be looking at impacts, and impacts, as you mentioned, Ricardo, can be related to noise, vibrations, vehicles, occupation of the land, etc. And so we're also going to be applying the mitigation hierarchy, obviously, in this area. Also, this is really a standard, and making sure that we implement avoidance each time we can. I guess one of the areas for avoidance is something that we've been doing both for oil and gas and now for renewables, is also setting no-go areas, making sure that in no-go areas there are no operations. And then for areas of particular sensitivity, we're going to be implementing biodiversity action plans with net gain, with third parties assessing and verifying that this net gain is achieved. And then in a number of sensitive or important activities for our business, we're also going to be doing certification and biodiversity action plans. So it's all a question of trying to understand what are the risks, what are the mitigation measures, and making sure that we are progressing on that. One of the data associated with the environmental baseline studies also is the fact that we transfer the data for science to GBIF, and just making sure that indeed the information is available, becomes available to the wider scientific community. And some of the learnings that we have along that route is that if you don't plan, if you don't schedule for the data to be transferred, then you've got a whole process of ensuring that you can rework the data, and the cost is much, much higher. So now we're really working into our programs the fact that the data should be transferable directly to GBIF. So those are some of the lessons that we've learned. Obviously, there are some guidelines which IPCA has issued initially for the oil and gas community, but those guidelines now also apply for renewables. And we've been setting a template of biodiversity action plans drawn from IPCA and making sure that all of our activities implement them. So we see a lot of bridges in a way between the two sectors, remembering that whereas you can have large oil and gas projects, in some cases in relatively pristine areas, which sets a number of challenges. For renewables, we also have the issue of cumulative impacts, and the fact that in a number of cases we've got activities around us which are not activities we know that well because it's other fields, other mitigation measures, etc. So those are some of the comments that I would like to make on that.
So thank you very much, Clément. Thank you for stepping in very quickly. I'm taking notes of all these challenges and solutions and ideas, and we'll do a wrap-up. But certainly, we also hope that in addition to the PICA guidelines, you're also going to use the IUCN TBC guidelines.
Of course, absolutely.
Not to put you on
that was the second part of my answer. Yes, because one of the questions you asked me was authorities. Where do authorities stand in all that? And so we know that there are a number of expectations that authorities have for oil and gas projects. In a number of cases, the authorities or the governments were using industry standards. And then we know, and we have progress, thankfully, and we are now also looking at IFC, of course, Equator Principles, and also what I would call in a way soft law, which is all the other guidelines from knowledgeable science-based guidelines, such as IUCN, TBC documents. But that we really see as a very useful way of promoting the right practices and helping, in a way, governments provide an enabling environment for our projects. It's very important that when projects are adequately managed, this is recognized one way or other, and we see authorities as a key actor in this in building this enabling environment.
Thank you very much. So let's go now back to Julia, and the question for Julia was, Julia is from Shell. She's participated also in the work that started in 2019. The mitigation hierarchy, what do you think about this framework? You were part of the discussion, so you were part of, structuring our guidelines around this specific framework. What are the benefits from a business perspective of using these stages? Why these help? And also, what is your experience as Shell in renewables in engaging with stakeholders?
Okay, thanks, Julia. Can you hear me well? Can you confirm you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, okay, good, thank you. So obviously, we've been working together on this guideline, and from a shared perspective, the mitigation hierarchy is the tool that we have used for some years in Shell as part of our practices, particularly in terms of how we approach the management of impact assessment for project development. And the mitigation hierarchy in principle help us a lot to explain and frame conversation with the project team we work with on the day-to-day when we engage with early phase discussion on projects. It helps to drive important early decision on each project development. And that's how we explain to the business manager and project manager how critical it is to take the right decision very early in the project development. So our priority is always to avoid negatively impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems. Can you hear me? Okay, it's not working.
Okay, it's working.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Do you want me to try without the video? Maybe it's better without the video. Okay. Okay, so again, the mitigation hierarchy principle help us to explain and frame conversation with project team, and it really help us to drive important early decision on each project development. As a big
Okay. No, I know, but is it coming through because I can't hear her? Sorry? EDF is saying it's coming. Okay. 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 Right, this one is not working, so sorry, just guide me because I am... Yes? Okay. Tell me when it's finished. Ah, okay. So Julia is not working. I'm so sorry, Julia. It's not coming through. So we need to let's see if we can loop you in back at the end. So Clément, you wanted to add something?
I'm happy to share some examples of things that we've been doing associated with renewables and biodiversity. We've been working on a number of topics. For example, we're repowering a field in La Réunion, in the island of La Réunion. That's both wind and solar, and we identified the a gecko, the Bourbon gecko, which is an endangered species there. And so we've been working and relocating and making sure that the repowering is associated with also some work on the gecko. This is one of the examples. We've also been working with some French academia on trying to monitor the impact of solar panels and solar farms and trying to, in a way, document systematically the potential impacts or the potential effects of these solar farms on biodiversity. So there are a couple of examples that we can think of. Again, Ricardo, you were mentioning cameras, etc. We've only got a few turbines right now equipped, but progress ongoing. I think it's R&D, and we're hoping that this can be expanded and automatized.
Thank you, Clément. And I think this idea of technology and for solutions is really important, because there is moving very fast. And I think one of the issues we figured when we were writing the guidelines, which of course doing it in collaboration takes longer than expected. By the end, we had to kind of go back and add additional references because there were new ideas coming up. And so this is a moving area, and it's great because new ideas, new solutions are being tested and kind of given the green light. So it's also where we need organizations in the scientific world, in academia, to keep investing, because some of the site level people, you know what I'm going to be asking you. Mining. Why are we talking about mining and renewables, and what are the opportunities and threats and areas really where we should really be careful when we are expanding renewable with regards to mining?
Julia, thank you, and hi everybody. The race to zero, or the whole process of decarbonization, requires an enormous amount of metals and minerals. And listening to one of the kind of major themes, certainly within this hub, but across the whole of the Congress, has been about nature positive, and looking at supply chains, looking at value chains, looking at where your raw materials are coming from. And we've been working with the World Bank for the last few years on their climate facility, and looking at forest smart mining, and trying to understand really what the footprint is. So they produced a report called Minerals for Climate Action, and there's an estimation that there are over 3 billion tons of metals needed to actually, help with this decarbonization trajectory. So it's not just about how much carbon you're saving, it's just where are the metals going to come from. Our study around forest smart mining estimated that close to 10% of the world's forests are at risk from mining impacts, because with 1,500 mines active in forested landscapes right now, it's causing a lot of direct footprints. So the mitigation actions that you have spoken to now are really about direct impacts, about creating objectives or delivering objectives-led frameworks through the mitigation hierarchy locally. This is really about these more indirect and induced impacts. So you think about 1,500 mines in a forested landscape. Each of those probably has a 75-kilometer radius of impact around it through the induced impacts that are coming in from in-migration of people, through the infrastructure, land use change to agriculture, that sort of thing. So we need to sort of take these factors into account when considering this. So, huge volumes of minerals and huge footprint too. The other point is that there's and you've heard me speak a little bit about this, perhaps around the option to head into the deep ocean to find these minerals. And there are a number of proponents who are saying, there's golf balls, potatoes, of polymetallic nodules strewn across our oceans by the gigaton. Let's just go into those places and start to exploit these resources. And of course, we've done a look at the impacts and risks of that, and there is a severe risk because of the scale of the impact, because of the scale of those types of operations, tens of thousands of square kilometers per concession of essentially what is equivalent to seabed trawling. It's just removing the sediments, removing habitats, removing biodiversity. So we can't just, move the problem from one place to another. It's really about limiting and managing the resources that we know of, that we have access to. It's about creating circular economies. It's about being responsible and thinking through, our full supply chains and chains of custody as to what actually our real footprint is. So a little bit like we've been asked to think about scope 3 on carbon, you know, there is a scope 3 around biodiversity too. And, you know, my philosophy or sort of mantra on this is that each of us who's responsible for a direct impact needs to look after that, so that when it comes to following this through a chain of custody, from, you know, the mine all the way to, you know, the electric vehicles that we all aspire to have, and that we may actually have to have the way directives are sending us. We may not be able to buy the diesel or petrol cars that we are currently driving, that we acknowledge that there are footprints way beyond those that we're currently dealing with. So I'm happy to take further questions or to add more detail on any of those studies. But just, sorry, one last point is that on the forest smart mining work and trying to help the mining sector to actually not only understand their footprint and deal with indirect and cumulative impacts in the landscape, we're looking at the whole role that nature-based solutions will help them to become nature positive, because you know, whilst you can be NPI to site, you may not necessarily be able to be nature positive through your in the landscape. And you know, I think honestly this is where the co-benefits that nature-based solutions can provide will help to address a lot of the other societal issues. And we've heard that some of those societal issues around economic development, and that's why the impacts happen in the way they do right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Pippa. This is very useful for also to discuss later when, you know, if there is going to be how we are going to work on these issues later on. So now I'd like to ask the second group to come here. If you give me this, I need to clean it. And sorry, we are multitasking here. Any particular order you'd like? No, you can sit next to me actually. Yeah, I mean. Okay, and perfect. So we start with you. All right. So second group. We have heard a lot about also the role of authorities, cumulative impacts. Also, I had questions for you very much related to the tools, the approaches, but also we are also talking about opportunities. We haven't yet touched that point, so that's going to be a question for you, Etja. But let's start with Nicola about sensitivity mapping. This is something that BirdLife International and all the BirdLife partners are very well known for. If you can tell us a little bit about what is that tool, how is that used in the planning phase, and what are the benefits to, you know, why is that, you know, helpful to avoid impacts?
Thank you. Yes, well, wind and solar radiation are widespread resources. Therefore, the most effective way to minimize their biodiversity impact is to identify and then avoid sites with sensitive wildlife. This is most effectively done when renewable energy is being strategically planned at a landscape scale. And the tool we've developed to help avoid potential conflict between energy infrastructure and wildlife is sensitivity mapping. This forecasts areas where energy infrastructure would have a negative impact on wildlife, so that developments can be focused on other areas where they would avoid such harm. Sensitivity mapping is an essential step in responsible renewable energy planning. And BirdLife is the world authority on avian sensitivity maps. For example, via our GEF UNDP Migratory Soaring Birds project to integrate biodiversity into public and private policies and practice of 5 sectors, and with additional support from the Marva Foundation, in relation to energy, we undertook soaring bird sensitivity mapping for all 11 countries along the Red Sea Rift Valley, and in total for 39 countries throughout the Mediterranean, Middle East and Northeast Africa. Our latest groundbreaking project is to create a free-to-access web tool called AviStep, the Avian sensitivity tool for energy planning, which will map the sensitivity of birds to on- and offshore wind farms, solar facilities and power lines. The initial phase is being funded by the Asian Development Bank and will cover India, Nepal, Vietnam and Thailand. Whilst it's now well established that such mapping is the best way to ensure wildlife safe renewable energy expansion, more needs to be done to mainstream this approach into renewable energy planning. An example of where this hasn't been done is the current alarming case in northeastern Brazil, where the French renewable energy company Voltalia, based in Paris, is currently developing a wind farm in an area that is the last refuge of the critically endangered Lear's macaw, listed as both an Alliance for Zero Extinction site, AZE, and a key biodiversity area, given its significance for this species. The Lear's macaw is found solely in this Brazilian state of Bahia. 40 years ago, there were fewer than 100 birds remaining in the world, yet in probably the most successful Brazilian bird conservation effort involving a wide range of stakeholders, there are almost 2,000 individuals today. The proposed wind project would destroy the birds' habitat and put them at risk of fatal collisions with wind turbines, turning this conservation success story from green to black, essentially. So it's now established that for critically endangered long-lived species like Lear's macaw, even low collision occurrence can have a potentially devastating population-level impact. For example, in India, collision with power lines linked to wind and solar facilities are rapidly driving the Great Indian Bustard to extinction. Sensitivity mapping would undoubtedly have flagged this as an inappropriate location that would jeopardize the future of Lear's macaw. It would also have highlighted the existence of numerous more suitable locations elsewhere in northeastern Brazil for such a development. Voltalia's failure to mainstream biodiversity into renewable energy planning is so complete that it even failed to consult IBAT or other spatial planning tools, which would have straight away shown them that this is a KBA and an AZE site. It apparently even ignored national level information that this site is designated by the Brazilian Ministry of Environment as a priority area for conservation of biodiversity in the Caatinga. It also shows what happens when IFC, International Finance Corporation, safeguards are ignored. Voltalia's own sustainability report states that Voltalia works to meet IFC performance standards on environmental and social sustainability. IFC's performance standards clearly states that AZC sites will not be acceptable for financing, with the possible exception of projects specifically designed to contribute to the conservation of the area. Indeed, the projects even failed to comply with local environmental laws. Although it was initially approved and the site's been largely cleared of vegetation, the State Public Ministry has called for suspension or cancellation of the project approval on July the 22nd, informing Voltalia that it should cease construction activity until an environmental impact assessment is prepared for the project. But as far as we know, it's still going ahead, so it's really a bit of a grim situation. So, yeah. Sorry.
I didn't know you were going to say this, but I thank you for saying this, because this you actually highlighted with this particular case, which is actually very recent. I know there is going to be a letter issued today or tomorrow. I really didn't know you were going to say this, but I'm actually very happy you actually have highlighted some important points. Tools that exist, solutions that could have been taken, and everything could have been prevented. And I think also for the companies, the importance of avoiding this, getting into this pickle in a way, because there are solutions, and also through the guidelines that we have collaborated with BirdLife to highlight how to avoid this. And actually this is a good way to start to ask Joe. I mean, it's not so much about yes, it's important about avoiding, but we also talked about go areas. So tell us a little bit, sorry, I take this, the concept of go areas, and why is important to change the narrative, and what are the opportunities for this particular sector to talk about, areas for development?
Sure, I think it's really important to acknowledge that this is a footprint that we need. Energy is the largest source of emissions, and we're not going to reduce emissions to the degree we need to address climate change unless we radically overhaul our energy system. So that's where I come from with this issue. We also have to acknowledge that we need a lot of renewables. Estimates are well over 10 times what we currently have installed. We also have to acknowledge that the favorite choice of renewables, wind and solar, right now are, they have a very large footprint. High probability for land use conflict that ultimately will slow or in some cases even stop the transition. We already see a lot of impacts from renewables that have been built. So a study that was published by University of Queensland 2020 looked pretty bit comprehensively at wind, solar, and hydro developments, and about 2,000 currently built renewable sites were in protected areas, KBAs, or wilderness areas. So not good siting as you indicated. Going forward, that's likely to continue. For example, the Nature Conservancy put out a study that looked at renewable energy targets under the Paris Climate Accord, translated NDCs into actionable renewables targets, and then placed those footprints on the ground. Like the retrospective study, we found similar kind of impacts to KBAs and to IUCN red-listed species. It's about 3.1 million hectares of KBAs could be impacted if we follow sort of a business-as-usual development strategy, and 1,500 plus IUCN red-listed species. Obviously, there's pretty good data to show that avoiding these kinds of issues is going to delay projects, increase project costs, and in some cases, shut projects down. The silver lining with this situation is that there's a lot of area that have both high renewable energy potential and will likely have lower value and be lower conflict. The reality is, though, that moving renewable energy towards those lower conflict sites is not going to happen by accident. It's going to require concerted effort that maps and models, policy and financial drivers that push development towards those particular sites. So you asked also about the go areas. So right now, the conservation community focuses in the way that we look at how we can balance conservation and development is largely reactive on a project by project, place by place basis. And we've got to move to bigger scale, larger spatial scales and earlier in the planning process. We're also really comfortable identifying places where we don't want to see development, but we really need to start to work collaboratively with the tools that we have that we use with our conservation planning work, our convening power to work with government and industry to start to look at where development can go. In this case, renewables. We're not going to start doing that for coal mines or other things, but we can do it, and we should be doing it for renewable energy. I can tell you from experience, we've done this in a handful of places, obviously not in a lot of places, but it works. So when you bring partners together with that objective, with the reality that you want to build renewable energy, you can actually find those solutions that facilitate it, reduce costs, and make it happen much more quickly. Last thing I'll say is IUCN can play a unique role in helping make this happen. The convening power that IUCN has to bring conservation organizations together, I think develop guidance that can help get other conservation organizations doing this kind of work. So hopefully, phase 2 of this will be a focus on trying to emphasize that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe. Yeah, thank you. So on the question, I'm actually moving to Fabien to talk about the cumulative aspect and also your experience in a number of projects without necessarily specifically speaking about a project, but we have been discussing a lot about site-specific and then going beyond, what Nicola was talking and Joe. What is your experience also in, on this area, and what would be your recommendations to address this particular problem?
Yes. Thank you. I'll start by telling you a little bit where I'm speaking from. And so Biotope is a consulting firm based in France that's actually been doing biodiversity work for the private sector for nearly 30 years, including 15 in wind energy. And so we're by far the market leader on that in France. And so what's interesting with this is that we've actually now been able to sort of track how the way biodiversity has been accounted for in the expansion of in particular, the wind energy sector in France from very early days. And so that includes very many aspects, like, as you said, the uptake of technology. So we're using fancy things like radars and acoustic monitoring, relatively complex statistics to actually quantify mortality on the wind power plants. Working now also, the new frontier, of course, is offshore wind, and so we're working on all of the French projects there, using, for example, high definition video. And so in doing this, we're collecting a lot of data. And what we're finding is that when we're asked to assess cumulative impacts, and we are asked to do that, that's what regulations require. One of the main hurdles is when you have very heterogeneous data, very different methodologies. Every project, every developer, every consultant basically does it his own way, and that makes it very hard to get that big landscape level picture or to assess things at the right scale where you want to look at those cumulative impacts. So there are efforts by the government to try and harmonize this on the methodological front, but it's really slow because, of course, you need to get everyone on board, and the better technologies tend to be more costly. So not everyone, uses some of the nicer or fancier gadgets, but that means that you can't readily compare the data. So this is really something that needs to be worked upon. And another place, if you like, where having that data, of course, would be useful would be for the spatial planning and identifying those no-go areas and the go areas. And you need the right level of data because, and this is an experience we have, and we discussed this when preparing the session. So France is probably one of several countries that actually has strategic plans, spatial plans for developing wind energy. It actually maps out places that should be prioritized for wind energy development. So maybe that's what you're calling a go area. But those are defined based on multiple criteria. Biodiversity criteria are some of those. But the level of detail, the spatial resolution is not the one that is then required for a developer once they've been smart and decided that they were going to develop their project in the go area. That's where they realize that actually, although you're in a go area, you still have to comply with regulations that ignore the fact that you're in a go area and require in-depth studies, mitigation, and in some cases quite stringent performance goals in terms of your impacts. And so that puts us certainly in a very difficult situation to have to explain that while the people who got together and created the go maps didn't have the data that you need to then get your project through at a later stage. And that creates, I think, a lot of frustration. And if we were able collectively to sort of bridge that gap, it would be great. And probably the wind, I'm talking a lot about wind, of course, here, but the wind energy sector, I think, is, of all the economic sectors, certainly that we work with, it's the one that generates the most data, actually massive amounts of data. When you do automatic recording, when you use acoustics, when you use radar, you can cover large spatial areas for long periods of time. And so most of the data that we collect and that we share on GBIF, we learned a few days ago that we are now a formally recognized GBIF data provider. So is actually data from wind energy projects. So the data's there, and we need to work to make that useful for the spatial planning.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and also for highlighting the key role that authorities for land use planning play, but also the importance of working together, making sure that the process is also efficient. I'm going to ask Etienne also to speak a little bit about the opportunity side of some of these projects, especially if they are located in an area of low biodiversity, and how actually renewable energy, offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar have experimented, and there are some experiments actually in the Netherlands right now on how actually these installations can help enhance biodiversity, but after the mitigation hierarchy, right?
Yeah, always. Thank you, Julia. Thank you. First, at EDF Renewable, we are dedicated to wind, solar, and battery technology. We are over 20 countries, and we develop, we build, and we operate our site for many years. So we have to be really strong on our commitment and our study. So it's really important for us from the beginnings. And we also have the benefit of an international community of environmental experts, and we share feedbacks because that's really important to define what's the good way. Sometimes also to discover that we have some issues the same, and we can find an answer, or sometimes it's not the good answer. So we have all these possibilities. And what is really interesting with renewable energy is that we can really adapt them. If you take a solar facilities, for example, you can change the distance between the row, you can change the height of the panel, you can change many things, and it's a great possibility to adapt for notably degraded site like brownfield site, and we can really adapt our structure, even our foundation, because we have a small footprint, and find the best way to have a direct link to biodiversity, environment, and our site. We share a case study in the guideline on the disuse military base. And when we start this project, we discover, for example, that it was well polluted. It was pyrotechnic pollution. We had many plastic waste, fuel tanks, etc. And we have removed 8,000 tons of soil polluted, and we have created a really nice meadow, and now the upkeep is realized by the farmer and is really enjoying the site, for example. We also refurbished and demolished for more than 200 buildings, and in half of them it was also full of asbestos and also of bats. So probably bats are not against asbestos, maybe. But for us, it was definitely an issue, and we have to work on the planning, find the best way, and we build a special guest bath house. It's really comfortable for them, and they look like they enjoy this building. So we have built some really great condition habitats on the site, and when we will leave this site in 30 years, we will have a really nice site for the community, and the biodiversity will be really enhanced, and we can be really proud of this project. We have many examples like that. We also work on the EDF facilities, some old thermal facilities or a power station like Aramon, where EDF already started a great job on biodiversity. And if you take now Aramon, it's now solar facilities. And we work on local vegetation, and we work with in partnership with the National Botanic Conservancy for the monitoring. So we have many examples of sites like that, and for us, they all have a common denominator. It's a tool that we share in the guideline also, and that's something that it's also a French commitment in Act for Nature, is that we implement some biodiversity management plan. The reason is we have to manage the vegetation on our site, solar site, because we have a lot of plant grows really well, and we have many species, and we have to give a safety access to our operator under the panel. And when you have too much vegetation, it's not possible, it's not safe. And we also have a lot of hole from badger, from a lot of species, boar, etc. So in high grass, that's really tough to sow them. So we have to provide a security condition. We also don't want some shadow on our row of panel, of course. But we can manage vegetation with positive or negative impacts. And with our biodiversity management plan, we focus on the positive aspect. We determine the best period of the year for every upkeep intervention. And it's really specific for each site, because we have some sites where we have some plants, for example, who won't survive if we mow them in the spring, for example, or if there are too much grass a year or too much bush, etc. So we define for each site what is the best period. If we have, for example, and we have a lot of cases where we have birds who are nesting on the meadow, we won't work on the meadow during this period, etc. And we create the best condition, the best habitat possible for many species, and we saw the results, and that's definitely impressive, especially when you start from a degraded site. You can see the difference before and after, and when we will leave the site, because we have a short period of time, it's for nature, we will give great condition for this site, for biodiversity, and we can be really proud of what we have done on this site. And for us, the biodiversity management plan is very important, because we will give the best condition, and we have also to explain it. And biodiversity is also a topic that we have to share, and we have to explain why your operator can work on a period of the year or he can not. And that's really important, because sensibilization also is important way for biodiversity, and renewable energy can help, because we have employees, of course, who choose this way. They want a better world, they want change things. We choose renewable energy, that's not for nothing, and they are really interested for biodiversity, and we have the opportunity to explain them and to show them in our solar facilities, for example, the good result. If we had a picture, it would be so interesting. And personally, I don't take a Nest or my camera too much when I visit our solar facilities, because you have so much space, you can spend just days and days. That's really amazing. So it's possible to create good conditions for everything.
Thank you, Etienne. It's my fault that there are no pictures, but I can't put no slides. Just okay. Yeah. So that's okay. So I was saying, what was I saying? Yes, quick question to you. In relation to enhancement, have you had the experience of enhancement plans being able to facilitate the permitting process?
Yes, it's maybe more direct or indirect. When we develop projects, we have to explain and we have to define when we avoid, when we reduce, and why. And if you don't have feedback, if you don't know if you will have a bad impact or good impact, it's difficult to design your project. And for us, it's interesting, because with biodiversity management plan, we can have some answer about what can be good or wrong, what we can do, what we cannot doing. And of course, we share all this result with the local authorities. So for us, it's really useful, and we also share them with NGOs, with everybody who is interested on our project. So on the permitting process, that's really important. And even for the biodiversity management plan, we need to be sure that we have realized a good impact assessment, because if we want to define the best measure, we have to know what was before, etc. So for us, it's really useful directly and indirectly, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. I forgot there was a second part to my question for Nicola, which is really more about highlighting initiatives that could help, that in relation also specifically to your sensitivity maps.
Don't worry, no surprises here. So the most recent guidance on reconciling nature and renewable energy from the recent IUCN publication to the guidance issued by the European Commission stresses the pivotal importance of early spatial planning through sensitivity mapping. In addition, this early spatial planning is promoted via the Convention on Migratory Species Energy Task Force, which is coordinated on behalf of the convention by BirdLife International. This multi-stakeholder forum brings together governments and not just environment ministries, but also energy ministries, the multilateral environmental agreements, investors, the private sector, and non-governmental organizations and experts, providing an important platform to engage on how to minimize the impact of renewable energy and energy distribution infrastructure on migratory species. For example, besides the sensitivity mapping, it promotes strategic planning at multiple scales, including cumulative impact assessment along the flyways of migratory birds. And this is vital to ensure ecological connectivity. Increasingly, the investor community is recognizing that to meet its biodiversity commitments, they must address biodiversity further upstream in the planning process. And so sensitivity mapping can provide an important mechanism through which to risk screen their investment opportunities, avoiding stuff like the Brazilian case. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Okay, so we have still a little bit of time. And this is an opportunity for the audience to ask a couple questions. We are just waiting to change the batteries in the mic. Who has a question? And then I'll pass this one. Yes. If you can just, I'll give you the mic, and if you can introduce yourself, and then.
Hi, can you hear me? Yep. So, hi, I'm Vanessa Tassos. I work for Société Générale, French bank. And so, can you hear me? You want me to shout?
No.
Can I take the mask? Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Hi. So yeah, no, my question was about, we talked about extractive industry, and can you hear me? We talked about extractive industry before, and we talk a lot about developed countries where the regulatory framework is quite developed, and we keep talking about land planning and land use. And I think that, I mean, from a financing perspective, I'm encountering a lot of projects. I look at a lot of transactions. And when it comes to renewable projects, my findings is that we are facing a lot of times projects where we don't have requirements, regulatory requirements, where the permitting is not mature enough, or where I would say the ministries, the environmental ministries actually require no environmental impacts, for instance. And so when we arrive at the financing stage, we are quite late in the process, and it's a bit difficult when we have our signatory of Equator Principles, we'll follow IFC performance standards. And so fair enough, we've got the guidelines, but not all the operators follow them. So it's a question to the audience, basically, what is, how do you see the trend? Do we have a hope that, the ministries are going to move towards like a more stricter requirement, I would say, because when we look at the impacts, they are different, but they're still impacts, compared to the other industries. So just a question.
Okay.
Thanks, that's a really great question. And I think that there have been some concerns that the renewable sector has been discounted, because you've got various directives, and I'm kind of speaking for particularly around Europe and the UK, where the race to zero is essentially saying, well, we'll shortcut what you have to do, or in looking at things like biomass projects or how you categorize different lithium metal impacts, and just certainly from the mineral side, as I was speaking to, we're not understanding those footprints and the kind of broader supply chain issues. And that a whole bunch of critical minerals are actually being fast-tracked too in order to provide the materials that are starting to build all of this. So, you know, whether it's power, or whether it's the electric batteries, or whether it's just sort of the broader infrastructure, it's huge. So I think it's an important one. I don't know if anyone else is sort of finding that shortcut in other parts of the world, but you know, COVID aside, we've seen lots of projects go through under the carpet as well, just because out of sight, out of mind. And building back better has to be building back green, sustainable, and nature positive, really.
Thank you, Pippa. I'm juggling. I'm not a good juggler. Sorry.
So I would point to two places where we've worked. One is India and the other is Indonesia. In both cases, renewable energy projects, amongst a lot of other kinds of development footprints, don't have to undergo an environmental impact assessment. In India, it's because they're green energy. So of course they're regardless of the size. The reality, though, is that the problem the government's running into is once they point to a particular project, in India, every square inch of the country is claimed by 5 different groups for 5 different reasons. There's a lot of pushback. And so, you know, the way that the work that we've done on both sort of identifying the no-go areas and the go areas is because we're not only considering the environmental piece, we're looking at some of the social cultural pieces, mapping those to try to find the path of least resistance. And it looks like it's starting to make some headway. So it's not through a regulatory driver, it's through a desire from the government to actually build these projects and the recognition that if they don't think about some of these issues, they're going to come back and you know, ultimately stop the projects. Very similar in Indonesia. Unfortunately, in Indonesia, it's the case for oil palm and other footprints, which, you know, we're not trying to necessarily advance.
Thank you. You want to answer?
Well, yeah, I think speaking to the more regulated environments, there is a very strong political push for more renewables, but this opposition, this local opposition, is very well organized, and you know, people really hate having wind power plants around them, and so it's actually one of the most prone sector in terms of court cases and having to take care of that, which I think also explains why, if you compare to other sectors, there is actually so much work being done on some of the biodiversity impacts. And if I may add, you know, the amount, the quantity of birds and bats that are killed by wind power facilities in France or Europe is probably orders of magnitude lower than that is killed on roads. Not to mention, you know, people's windows, but just, you know, vehicular traffic. But I'm still waiting for someone to show me a road EIA that has a mortality assessment and that, you know, requires the kind of mitigation and compensation for that mortality that is every day required from wind power development.
Thanks, Fabien. But just I wanted to highlight, however, that when we did our work, we also wanted to demonstrate that it's not just about birds, but there are a lot of other factors and a lot of other elements of biodiversity that we have to include. But the most important thing, we don't want this, you know, the cry for biodiversity to stay in between renewable energy and, you know, that being a solution for climate change. So anybody, you want to add something? Sorry.
Yes, I also think that it makes a lot of business sense to properly assess your impacts, understand and share the potential impacts that your activities will have with the communities, and so it's also a need. There's also this need for transparency, just to share the data and to build on that. So it's not just about legislation. It's not just about what might be compulsory, but it also makes a lot of business sense in my view. So it's a win-win situation, I feel. Yeah. And one thing that we need to avoid is single-use data. I mean, it's really, really useful to share the data, to build and to feed the databases.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
You want to be ready?
I just want to add a few points too, a bit commenting on what Fabian said, because each country is a reality. I think actually in Portugal, where I come from, actually we have several local communities wanting to have the wind farms nearby, because they have, of course, they receive a tax from the developers each year, and that helps them to develop roads, whatever, schools, whatever needed. So actually it depends so much on the countries. I guess that in Central Europe or in UK, where you have so many of your natural landscapes already occupied, people don't want to lose anything else, so they will fight back against even renewables, although I think they will understand the positive effect of them ultimately. But in other countries, maybe less populated, where the good wilderness areas have less population because they emigrated, for instance, the few people left really want renewables to come close to them. Just another short comment on what Fabian said about comparing, well, mortality rates from wind farms and roads. For instance, that's of course true, but it's not only about quantity, it's also about quality, and some of the species that get killed in wind farms that are much more threatened than those more common species that can get killed easily every day in our roads. But the last comment, it's just to comment on the question. Yeah, it's a bit strange, the point that we came out now, that the wind energy developments that require a loan from a bank and from financing institutes are the ones that are being much more scrutinized, because there are performance standards that are highly demanding. Whereas those that don't require that, either because they have national capital to invest or something like that, they are not complying with the same demanding and fairly demanding concerns about the environment. And of course, I think that will only change by, well, public awareness and strong lobby from IUCN and other institutions worldwide, BirdLife and FFI, of course.
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo. This is really very much in line with our plans to continue working on this topic and really bring together a coalition of companies and IUCN members to call for better regulations, specifically, spatial planning that have been assessed also for their impacts, looking at also tools such as, sensitivity maps and all the, the analysis that is done in data. I think that the issue of data has been mentioned many times, and it's really, really important. Of course, data comes at different stages. For the land use is before you guys are even there. So there is also other data that needs to be collected. But I think the point about making this data homogeneous and available, it's really important. I mean, it's something that has been mentioned by the conservation community in many fora and in relation to different sectors, and certainly something that we should all keep highlighting for this importance. I think, yeah, we have time to take, let me just check, a couple more questions. Yes, sorry,
thank you.
If you come a bit closer, yep. If you come a bit closer, because unfortunately not everybody has the headphones on.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you for this interesting presentation. Just to add a little bit on, what Ricardo said about impacts on roads. Well. Our biodiversity assessments really show us that roads, of course this is difficult to compare, but certainly for certain groups, wind farms are much more, impact much more certain groups of fauna than the roads. And I would just like to say that I would like to have heard a little bit more about hydropower, which is renewable too. And while in Europe and maybe a few more sites in the world, the big hydropower infrastructures maybe have already been constructed, or many of them at least, that's not true for a great part of the rest of the world. But even for Europe, we have now a big issue that is becoming more and more on the spotlight, which is the barrier removal, which means to remove old hydropower infrastructures and dams which are no longer operational. And so just to say that I would like to have heard a little bit about it, and I don't know if anyone can add some comments on this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. But I will say we will not talk about this at the moment because we have 3 minutes. And as you said, it's a really big issue, controversial and complicated, and we can't do justice in 3 minutes. The focus was, yes, it's true that the title said renewable, but was really about the work we have done, which is on solar and wind. There is a lot of discussions also at the UCN level on hydro, and we can talk about it later. But yeah, well, it wouldn't be doing justice to the issue and the problems asking somebody to answer like that. There was one more question in the back, and then we will have to close because there is another event coming up.
Hi, I'm coming from the energy community, which is at, maybe I'll just come closer. I'm coming from the energy community. We are, with our contracting parties, preparing NECP, which are these national energy and climate plans. And we are trying to actually introduce models like what you already presented today, like some kind of not spatial planning, but in a way determine priority, what to do first or what to do last or what to do not at all. Or maybe as the model that was presented by TNC in terms of improving the usage of a specific place. So what I wanted to ask you all is whether do you have any experience where you institutionalize this, where was this actually taken further on and it was either obligatory or in any manner not obligatory, but requested by some party before they decide on what to do where. Just I'm out of curiosity because now we are dealing with this and we have some issues how to frame this for our contracting parties, how to make them use models or use tools like this, because that's what we are facing for. Our region also has this conflict with now the hydro are a little bit out, but the focus is on wind and solar, and I think that now is the right time to address this. And just to maybe comment on the question of Societe Generale, yesterday there was a great presentation by the European Investment Bank. They're introducing biodiversity risk assessment within their structural, when they're assessing loans, when they're assessing projects and etc. And I think that that's something that it can also be used by other banks. They will going to have this a lot. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. I will ask maybe Joe to give a quick, and Joe, and then maybe either Etienne, you want to quick take about.
Yeah, so if I was following, you're asking whether we were able to get some of these principles embedded in a regulatory process. Probably the easiest place to talk about is in the desert Southwest in the U.S. So there's a solar development plan that dates back about 10 or 15 years, where the federal government had established really aggressive solar energy targets. We did a bunch of spatial planning and mapping that identifies things like no-go areas, work really closely with the industry, our National Renewable Energy Lab, so a lot of energy modelers, go back to the capacity expansion models and dispatch models, which usually precedes targets that are set for things like wind and solar, and embedded the social, the environmental into those models so that the outputs that they're saying you can build this much wind is the capacity expansion modeling is happening in one place, conservationists are doing their modeling somewhere else. And so, they're not integrated. That was super novel. It was really pushed by the BLM and at the time the Obama administration, which was pretty more progressive than where we're at now. Or we'll see what Biden does. And so that opportunity to sort of embed the science then into that regulatory process, what was permitted, where, was pretty amazing to see. It's one of only, I think, 2 examples that I know of that have really done that. Ultimately, I would say that's the end game that we want to see. So our work in India is trying to push that that kind of approach. Let's go back to the capacity expansion models and start to embed some of these values into those so that we're influencing the broad decisions on not only renewables, but what mix of renewables and what places have the least impact. And then embed that into the permitting process.
Thank you, Joe. I think, because we are closing down. I think the lessons, I'm just listening, trying to catch up, to summarize very quickly, and I know I'm not doing justice to the amazing knowledge that there is here and to also your questions, but I just wanted to highlight, we have been mentioning the word collaboration, and directly or indirectly, and a lot of these things really require collaboration. What you were just talking, Joe, is about different agencies working together, because I think the problem that we have are there because the agency don't talk. You have somebody doing renewable energy, which is great, is where we want to be, and then you have another agency looking at conservation in different places, and they really about bringing the data and the goals together. So the other thing we really talked about is cross-sectoral, also within the sector and collaboration for sharing data, and especially in addressing the cumulative impacts. And this is really key in terms of making sure that we avoid these impacts. Another point about risk, and certainly the authorities have a great opportunity to de-risk projects by creating this common, level playing field, putting the regulations in a level that then, the companies investing, they have just to do the last mile, which is the detailed impact assessment for their site, but they know they're going in an areas that is fairly low risk. But in terms of financial institutions, yes, the comment has been made. This is true also for other sectors, and I have to say, unfortunately, but this is our world, where financial institutions have been the driver often for best practices, and then the regulators come, after. This is why actually we did the guidance that is really dedicated for decision makers in financial institutions, but also utilities, really early screening, red flagging, so with a series of questions with links to the database to help you ask the right questions and these are not generic questions, these are questions that link specific features of solar, onshore wind and offshore wind. So, hopefully becoming a little bit more specific. So with that, I'm just going to ask to put the second, because I wanted to tell you a little bit about phase 2, where we want to be, and where I say we is IUCN with, the organization that we have worked with in the past, and hopefully more. And I think some of the topics that we want to focus on really are a response to some of the issues that have been addressed, and is really looking at cumulative impacts. What does it mean? How can we help regulators to address them? And we are talking about cumulative and indirect or induced impacts, and the induced impacts is also the kind of stream of work we want to work on, which is related to raw materials and ensuring that the sector as a whole pushes for better sourcing and use. So what are the best standards, and how do you actually put in place a chain of custody that is efficient? So we don't want extra cost and extra burden, but we want results and impact. So in the work on cumulative impact will also include the go areas, and how do you do this in practice? What are the most, best solutions at the regulatory level to incorporate this in decision making? And of course, we hope also through this work to demonstrate that the mitigation hierarchy actually can have a positive impact on nature. So on this, I would like to thank all the speakers. And those who are sitting on the front row, please stand up. Thank you very much. Also Julia Touron from Shell, that unfortunately at the end she couldn't join us because her internet didn't really work, and it's really a pity. She's in France, but she couldn't be with us. So thank you very much, Julia, if you're listening to us. And if you can put to the next slide, please. I'm sorry, I don't know where the clicker is. We have videos, and so when you go and see the slides, you will see. And then the next slide, please. So for further contacts in terms of IUCN on this project, this is Rachel Azanta, is my colleague and she's not with us today, but she can give you all the follow-up questions about the IUCN collaboration. And thank you very much for participating today. Thank you. Thank you.
much.